Today is May 17, 2026, and the most important geopolitical miscalculation of the past week did not happen in the Strait of Hormuz. It did not happen in the Security Council chamber. It did not happen on any battlefield or in any intelligence operation. It happened in a building in Beijing where two governments sat down to restructure the North American economy and forgot to check whether the country they were restructuring it around had spent 3 months preparing for exactly this moment. Canada was not in that building. Canada was notified that meetings were happening. Canada was not given the courtesy of a phone call from its largest trading partner before that trading partner flew to the capital of its primary strategic competitor and agreed to arrangements specifically designed to reduce Canadian industrial capacity, redirect Canadian export markets, and migrate Canadian investment southward into American territory. A White House advisor said it out loud. Canada was simply a country whose industrial prosperity could be kept at home in America instead of shared. That sentence said privately, leaked immediately, is the sentence that Mark Carney read when it appeared in his briefings. And then he made 3 phone calls, not to Washington, to Tokyo, to Berlin, and to a third capital not publicly confirmed, but whose alignment with everything that followed suggests it was Brussels. 48 hours after Air Force One touched down at Joint Base Andrews, Carney walked to a podium in Ottawa. No teleprompter, maple leaf flags, 2 cameras. He stood still while the room went completely quiet. And then he spoke. But to understand why this moment matters, why Section 14, Paragraph 3 of the North American Manufacturing Priority Act and $94 billion in redirected agricultural contracts do not equal the outcome Washington calculated, you need to understand what was decided in Beijing 3 weeks before Trump's official arrival, why the industries targeted were chosen with surgical precision, and why the person who received the news was not the politician Washington expected to be managing this confrontation. 3 weeks before the official visit, a quiet delegation left Washington with no press coverage, no official schedule, no diplomatic announcement. Members traveled separately, checked into separate hotels, met in a building not on any public registry. 72 hours later, the architecture of the most consequential economic confrontation in the North American relationship's history had been drafted. Canada was not in the room. On May 13th, the White House released the North American Manufacturing Priority Act, a 47-page policy document whose technical language pointed at exactly one country. Any company seeking maximum federal tax incentives had to locate all strategic production inside the United States. Not North America, not USMCA territory, the United States. Battery manufacturing, semiconductor fabrication, electric vehicle components, AI infrastructure, defense supply chain inputs. And then Section 14, Paragraph 3. Companies relocating strategic production from USMCA partner nation to the United States within 18 months would receive an additional 15% tax credit on top of existing incentives. Read that again. Washington was not just encouraging domestic investment, it was actively subsidizing companies to extract production capacity from Canada, followed immediately by $94 billion in Chinese agricultural purchasing agreements. Soybeans, beef, pork, wheat redirected overnight from Canadian suppliers to American ones. Trump stood in the Great Hall of the People and said 4 words that dominated Canadian coverage for days. Good runs end. And then Canada answered, not with statements, with strategy. Ontario had invested more than $30 billion in electric vehicle infrastructure, battery plants, component manufacturing, research corridors connecting university engineering to factory floors. The province was positioning itself to become the EV capital of North America. The Manufacturing Priority Act specific targeting of battery manufacturing, EV components, semiconductor fabrication, and AI infrastructure was not a general industrial policy statement. It was a targeted disruption instrument aimed at exactly that investment architecture. Section 14E's additional 15% credit for relocating from a USMCA partner within 18 months was the accelerant. Canada's lithium, nickel, cobalt, and rare earth deposits are not incidental to the EV battery supply chain. They are its physical foundation. The strategy attacked the manufacturing layer while redirecting investment capital away from the mining layer simultaneously. A two-dimensional assault designed to leave Canada holding raw materials while value-added production migrated south. Not a supply chain partner, a quarry. The $94 billion agricultural redirection is where the human dimension becomes most visceral. Canadian canola futures fell 11% in the first hour after Beijing agreements became public, down 19% by noon. A grain farmer outside Regina, 22 years of selling canola to Chinese buyers, sat in his truck in his own field for 40 minutes before he could bring himself to call his bank. He did not say he was angry. He said two words: "We are being replaced." 2 words, not 3, not 4, 2. And those 2 words captured what financial analysis of futures markets does not capture: what it feels like to be the mechanism through which 2 governments chose to serve their mutual interests, redirecting flows that sustained your operation, without a phone call, without a notification, without the basic acknowledgement that a century of economic partnership might have entitled you to before the arrangement was concluded in your absence. Now, let's talk about Mark Carney with the analytical precision his background demands, because understanding who the specific person is explains why the response that followed was not the response Washington modeled. Carney is not a politician who learned economics as a policy tool. He is an economist who spent 3 decades at the absolute apex of the global financial system. Governor of the Bank of Canada during the 2008 financial crisis. Governor of the Bank of England, the first and only non-British citizen in the institution's 300-year history to hold that position. 13 years as a managing director at Goldman Sachs, navigating negotiations where a single misplaced word costs billions. A doctorate in economics from Oxford. He does not reach for outrage. He does not raise his voice in public. He moves with the specific stillness of someone who has spent a career in rooms where the person who shows urgency first has already lost something. The night the Beijing agreements became fully public, Carney did not call a press conference. He read every page of the Act. Section 14, Paragraph 3. Every line of the agricultural framework. 4 hours. Then 3 phone calls. Tokyo, Berlin, the third capital, not Washington. The omission of Washington from the initial call sequence was itself the first strategic communication. 48 hours later, he walked to a podium in Ottawa. No notes, no teleprompter. He stood still for a moment while the room went completely quiet. Canada is not a bargaining chip. 3 seconds of silence. Canada is not a concession in someone else's framework. Canada is not a line item negotiated in rooms where it was not invited to sit. 3 days ago, the President of the United States sat in Beijing and agreed with a government that Canada has been diplomatically managing with careful consistency for decades, to arrangements explicitly designed to reduce Canada's manufacturing capacity, redirect Canada's export markets, and undermine Canada's investment environment. He did not consult us. He did not notify us. He did not extend the basic diplomatic courtesy that one nation extends to another after more than a century of alliance. He looked up from his notes, directly into the camera. To those who believe Canada will absorb this quietly, that patience is the same as weakness, that restraint is the same as submission. 3 seconds of complete silence. You have misread us, and the misreading will be expensive. That press conference was watched 47 million times in the first 24 hours. Trump's response arrived the following morning on Truth Social. Carney is all talk, no action. Canada's economy is a mess. Very weak. That characterization required revision by the end of the same week, because while Trump was posting, the response was already executing 6 simultaneous coordinated moves, not announced as a package, not framed as retaliation, presented as routine exercises of Canadian sovereign economic policy. Together, they constituted the most precisely organized economic counterpositioning by a middle-sized power against a superpower in modern diplomatic history. And they were all in motion before Trump posted his response. Move 1. Canada formally notified the U.S. Trade Representative it was initiating a comprehensive USMCA compliance review, flagging Section 14E's relocation incentives as potential violations of the agreement's investment neutrality provisions. The USMCA is a binding international agreement that the United States drafted, negotiated, and signed. Canada was invoking the agreement Washington itself authored. The compliance review has no scheduled resolution date. It is running, and every corporate legal team evaluating the Section 14 relocation credit has had to factor that outcome into its long-term investment calculus. Move 2. Canada announced a $40 billion sovereign fund, specifically structured to replace the Chinese investment capital Beijing's agreement with Washington had redirected away from Canadian mining projects. This fund was not improvised in 48 hours. Sovereign funds of this capitalization do not appear fully structured on that timeline unless the legal framework, the funding mechanism, and the investment mandate were already prepared before the triggering event occurred. The preparation predated the trigger. Move 3. Canada announced a new bilateral industrial partnership with the European Union, a fast-tracked manufacturing investment corridor that EU trade officials had been drafting for months, waiting for the political moment that would make its announcement credible and urgent. EU capital began moving toward Canadian industrial assets at the specific moment that American policy had created a discount in Canadian asset valuations. The discount was the opportunity. The corridor was the vehicle. The preparation was the advantage. Move 4. Canada signed preferential market access agreements with Japan, South Korea, and Australia for critical mineral supply, 3 of the 4 economies whose industrial futures most urgently require a trusted alternative to Chinese-controlled mineral supply chains. Move 5. Canada released a full economic impact assessment whose specific numbers were designed for a specific audience, not voters, not journalists. The boardrooms of companies evaluating the Section 14 relocation credit. More than $800 billion in annual bilateral trade. 3.2 million American jobs directly dependent on Canadian supply chains. 41% of total American crude oil imports from Canada with no viable alternative source within a 5-year horizon. These were not political arguments. They were material dependencies presented in the format that people making capital allocation decisions require before they can act. Move 6 was the one that produced the most immediate measurable results. Carney personally called the CEOs of 11 major American corporations with significant operations in both countries, not to threaten them, to do the math with them out loud, allowing each executive to perform the calculation their own financial and legal teams would eventually deliver anyway, just faster and with more precision than the corporate process would have produced on its own timeline. When the calls were done, 7 of the 11 companies publicly announced they were pausing relocation reviews pending further regulatory clarity. One company proceeded and discovered that the 90-day streamlined regulatory approval Washington advertised has in practice involved timelines closer to 4 years. The secondary effects are now producing outcomes the initial framing of this situation completely failed to anticipate. 2 of 3 Chinese battery manufacturers that pivoted away from Ontario after the Beijing summit have quietly reinitiated conversations with their original Canadian partners, not out of sentiment, because the Canadian infrastructure was already built. The Canadian workforce was already trained. The Canadian supply chain connections were already operational. The $30 billion Ontario invested over years produced a platform that could not be replicated in a new American location without the time and investment that erased the economic advantage the 15% credit was supposed to provide. The credit was large enough to generate the announcement. It was not large enough to make the full economics of actual relocation work. 3 European sovereign wealth funds committed a combined $22 billion to Canadian mining projects in the weeks following the summit capital that had been observing Canadian assets with interest, waiting for the discount that investment uncertainty provided. Washington created the sale. The buyers who arrived were European, not American. A Wall Street analyst note circulated to every major financial desk on 3 continents summarized the situation with the directness that financial sector communication uses when the data is clear. The administration appears to have confused Canada's patience with Canada's weakness. The distinction is becoming expensive. 1 week after Air Force One returned from Beijing, a journalist asked the press secretary 3 questions in sequence. Had the administration calculated what a successful Canadian USMCA compliance claim would cost American businesses? The answer was hedged. Had the administration reviewed Canada's economic impact assessment showing 3.2 million American jobs tied to Canadian supply chains? The answer was non-committal. And when the president said Canada's good run was over, was that the official position of this administration on the alliance? The press secretary paused. The cameras stayed on. 4 seconds of silence. And then she moved to the next question without answering. That 4-second pause played directly adjacent to Carney's Ottawa press conference across every Canadian news organization that evening. The contrast required no commentary. One side had looked into a camera with no notes, no teleprompter, and said exactly what it believed clearly, precisely, with the stillness of preparation rather than the urgency of improvisation. The other side had needed